You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 12th of May 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello there and a very warm welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Emma Nelson, and coming up on today's programme, has a deal been done to avert a trade war between the US and China? We'll have the latest on this weekend's talks aimed at calming things down. Also ahead, in the next 30 minutes, voting is underway in Philippines' midterm elections. We'll examine how this has become an existential battle for the country's two political dynasties. And we'll hear the news from Brazil. Joining me in the studio is Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Hello, Faye. What's on your list?
Hello, Emma. Today we discuss Brazil's investment in the agribusiness sector in Angola, plus what does it mean to be a soap opera villain in 2025?
Thank you for that. Plus a preview of this year's Cannes Film Festival. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. We begin today's news with the announcement that the United States says a deal has been reached with China to settle the trade war brewing between the two nations. A meeting was held between them over the weekend in Geneva, with China also saying progress has been made, but in a slightly more muted manner than the United States. Well, I'm joined now by Steve Tang, who's director of the China Institute at SOAS, the University of London. Good afternoon, Steve.
Good afternoon, Emma.
So, do we have a deal?
Well, we have an agreement to suspend the trade war and reduce the level of tariff back to 30% on the US side, 10% on the Chinese side. So they will have 90 days to talk before they can reach a deal.
So that is a much more palatable figure than the ones that we were talking about before, which is 145% import duties by the US and 125% by the Chinese, respectively. I mean, how much can we quantify how much damage has already been done by this?
Well, I think what we can see is that when the tariff was over 100%, effectively there was a suspension of trade. And Chinese manufacturers were not shipping everything that had been ordered by the US when the tariff was in place. And that puts pressure on American shops and other companies because they are not getting what they need. And the Chinese themselves were under huge amount of pressure because the economy was clearly not sustainable on that basis. That's, I think, the reason why it was relatively easy for both sides to find a way to calm down, with neither side appearing to lose face.
Well, what had happened in the previous moments is that the Chinese had come out quite strongly on this, saying we are prepared to suffer. We can ride this through, and there was very much a sense that this was going to be, China was going to sort of prevail with this. Do we know who blinked first?
Well, I think clearly Donald Trump blinked first. The Chinese were not wrong. I think while both economies suffer, China had, at least in the short to medium term, a much higher tolerance of pain. And the political process in the United States means that the US president would come under pressure much more quickly. And since it was Donald Trump who started the process and Xi Jinping merely matched the increase of tariff that were imposed by Donald Trump, and finally it ends with Donald Trump asking for a meeting that both sides found a ways to calm down.
So what happens now? You mentioned the 90 days. I mean, it is all too easy to come across with a solution which is an agreement in principle just to suspend hostilities. Now the detail and the figures start to come to the fore. So how do the two sides approach the detail to make sure that neither appear to be losing?
With difficulties. I think coming to an agreement is not going to be easy. Something like the new status quo, 30 on the US side for tariff, 10 on the Chinese side, is something which the Chinese can tolerate and work with. but it's not ideal from their perspective. They want to get a better deal than that. And Donald Trump wants to get a better deal for the United States, or from his perspective for the United States, whether it's actually in the US interest or not. So the discussions are going to be difficult. And if the Chinese side thought that a deal was really in the pocket, they would be much more likely to agree to a top-level meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump to clinch the deal. That is not happening. We are talking about Scott Bessent on the US side and He Lifeng on the Chinese side continuing to discuss for the next 90 days. So they are not seeing an end in sight, not in the immediate future.
One thing that also needs to be factored in, and this has now become a regular part of any discussion about Donald Trump and his foreign policy, is that he changes his mind at the drop of a hat. Is there any sense that there can be something to mitigate against any unpredictable announcements from the White House?
I think the Chinese would dearly love to find what that is. The reality is that Donald Trump's decision-making is very personal, very individual, and he changes his mind, as you say. So that is something the Chinese have to bear in mind. I think they do bear in mind, which is also one of the reasons why they're being very cautious in how they want to negotiate and not put Xi Jinping up anywhere anytime soon.
How much are the Chinese now pivoting elsewhere? I mean, we have seen them deploy or use other countries as places to sort of divert their goods for export to try to make sure that the tariffs are minimized. But has this forced a little bit of more permanent rethinking in Beijing?
Oh, I think the Chinese would be continuing their efforts to reduce their dependence on the US as an export market. In fact, this started in the first Trump term, and it continued through the Biden era, even though not with that much success on the Chinese side. They became still very heavily dependent on the US market. But their intention is to reduce that dependency, and they will continue to do so even if they can get a deal with Donald Trump. They don't want to put the Chinese economy at risk of being controlled and shut down by Donald Trump or any US president.
Steve Tsang, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. The time here in London is 8 minutes past midday. You're listening to The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. A quick summary now of the day's other news headlines. Here's Carlotta Rebello.
Thanks, Emma. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he will be in Turkey to negotiate with Russian President Vladimir Putin personally. On Sunday, Putin spoke to Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who expressed readiness to host the talks. Erdogan also spoke to the French President Emmanuel Macron, stating that a historic turning point had been reached in the efforts to end Russia's war. A temporary Gaza ceasefire deal is close to being finalized in talks between the US and Hamas officials in Qatar. The agreement is said to include a 21-day truce and the initial release by Hamas of up to 6 hostages in return for a number of Palestinians held in Israeli jails. It will also provide for the resumption of aid relief into the enclave 2 months after Israel halted the flow of life-saving supplies. And Taiwan is inviting foreigners living in the country to complete a questionnaire about how well they believe the public sector is working to improve road safety. Casualties and deaths involving foreign nationals, mainly Indonesians and Vietnamese, have nearly doubled over the past 5 years. Foreigners have until Friday next week to submit the questionnaire. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Emma.
Thank you very much indeed, Carlotta. Now, ordinarily, the midterm elections in the Philippines don't make the international headlines. Well, however, this year's vote has become the battleground for a feud between the country's two political dynasties, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and the Vice President, Sara Duterte, daughter of the former president, Rodrigo Duterte. They were once united. They campaigned together and won power together. But the two former allies have fallen out, and these elections could well determine each of their political fates. I'm joined now by Ronald Holmes, who's Professor of Political Science at De La Salle University in Manila. Good afternoon, Ronald.
Good afternoon, Emma.
This is what appears to be a dynastic fight to the death. How did we get here?
Well, it all started essentially when the former President Rodrigo Duterte failed to convince the daughter to run either as president or vice president in 2022. To spite the father, Sara Duterte eventually slid as vice presidential candidate in tandem with Ferdinand Marcos Jr. So in that sense, from the very start, there was some animosity between the former president, Rodrigo Duterte, and Bongbong Marcos. The former president even called, at that time, Bongbong Marcos a spoiled brat, and without naming him, said that there's someone running as president who's a drug addict for that matter. So it's been there since 2021. And it eventually snowballed into an open conflict beginning, I think, September 2023.
And now we have Sara Duterte being impeached and Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Trying to sort of swim for his political life. Just explain a little bit more about what hangs in the balance for each one if they were to succeed and indeed if they were to fail.
Yeah, on the part of Sara Duterte, it's really a question of the impeachment trial that's impending. The upper chamber, the Senate, would be the impeachment court. They should start the impeachment trial sometime in early June. Half of the Senate is up for election in this today, and it will really depend on whether Bongbong Marcos will get about 8 to 9 seats of those 12. And try to persuade at least 16 senators to convict Sara in that impeachment trial. On the other hand, in the case of Sara Duterte, what they've been trying to do is to generate sympathy with what they refer to as the kidnapping of the former president, which is actually a legal arrest as ordered by the ICC, and trying to get in as many as 4 to 5 of their candidates, including 2 candidates who were part of the alliance of the administration, the president's sister, and another one who's a representative who's the daughter of the richest Filipino in the country who happens to be also embroiled in politics.
And what is this doing to the Philippines as a nation? Because Sara's father, Rodrigo Duterte, ruled and governed strongly and with a clear mandate. The fact now that we have this sort of weakness at the top of power, how does that trickle down to everyday life?
Well, it basically doesn't help ordinary Filipinos. For many Filipinos, the current conditions are bleak and the future remains to be bleak. We're in a country where many of those who are running in these elections basically belong to political dynasties. About 8 out of 10 of the elective positions are actually held by political dynasties, many of whom are running uncontested or virtually uncontested in this election. So it's not something that it's lamentably bad for the country. We've seen a more significant polarization as a result of this conflict between the two most prominent political families, Bongbong Marcos on one hand and the Dutertes on the other side.
And just finally, the reputation of the Philippines internationally has changed. In what way by this? Because no one likes a country which can't get its house in order.
Yeah, basically it brings back the reputation of the country as an electoral autocracy, as a very elite, where democracy is essentially under the control of the elite. It makes us more vulnerable to the poaching coming from many of the major superpowers. We know that under Duterte, the Chinese had more influence on Chinese foreign policy. Under Bongbong Marcos, they swing back towards an alliance led by the West. So we're in, I think, internationally, we're seeing really not so much confidence on the part of, let's say, even investors towards going to the Philippines or coming to the Philippines for foreign direct investments. So it's bad for the country. We could have had a much more cohesive administration, despite the fact that there's still some of the more prominent political elites. There's still exclusivity. But with these warring political elites, I think the country is this time to go into and see a lame duck president or vice president that will still be very popular and would really use that popularity to continually hit on the president and derail whatever reforms there would be in the coming 3 years, leading up to the presidential elections in 2028.
Ronald Holmes, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Manila. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. We head to Turkey now, where a near 4 decades-long insurgency that's caused the deaths of 40,000 people could be drawing to a close. The Kurdish PKK militant group has said it is to disband. It had declared a ceasefire in March. Well, to tell us more about the latest announcement, let's hear from Hannah Lucinda Smith, who's Monocle's Istanbul correspondent. She joins us from Istanbul. Very good afternoon to you, Hannah.
Good afternoon.
So we have had years of ceasefires, agreements, the possibility of a conclusion to this insurgency. Is this now it?
Well, I think there's always a sense of hope whenever a ceasefire is called. I was here in Turkey back in 2013 when the last ceasefire was called, and there was huge jubilation at that. Unfortunately, that only lasted for 2 years and then broke down very bloodily. And it's because of those kind of experiences that people have a sort of mix of optimism and caution.
So explain to us what has happened then.
So over the past few months, the government of Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been reaching out, particularly to the main Kurdish party, the Dem party here in Turkey, and organising visits to Abdullah Öcalan, who's the leader of the PKK. He's been in a prison, island prison in Turkey since 1999. And for the past few years, since that last peace process broke down pretty much, visits to him had been cut off. They were restarted. Then in February came a call from Öcalan for the PKK to lay down its arms, which it did in Turkey. Here's a key thing. This ceasefire, it seems, won't apply to the PKK franchise in Syria, the YPG, which of course has, turned into something, quite different actually to the PKK in Turkey. And of course, also got the backing of American forces for a long time. So again, some question marks about how exactly this is going to work.
So the next question is, how is this going to work, given the fact that the process to bring about a ceasefire and then the disbanding of the PKK has been done in a very discreet way behind closed doors? So do we know where the weapons are going to go, where the organisational capacity is going to be, how it's going to be taken down, to ensure that not only does the PKK not reform, but those who are members feel as if they can be at peace with this?
Yeah, of course. And this was one of the problems in 2013. The PKK laid down its arms in Turkey, but at exactly the same moment, the YPG just over the border in Syria was kind of gaining in strength. So many of those fighters with their weapons just went over the border into Syria, sort of swelled that, PKK-linked force there. And then that blew back again across Turkey's border a couple of years later. So no details have yet been released and might not be released actually about the exact details of how these weapons are going to be handed over. It's obviously going to be a complex process. I think it'd be interesting to see, who the guarantors of that are going to be. But alongside that, really importantly, there needs to be a kind of political process. Actually, Kurdish rights socially are a really, really low ebb. And, that's happened since 2015. Things like Kurdish language centres, cultural centres have been closed down. And I think unless these things are, start to be reinstated and there's some kind of political and social dialogue, any ceasefire just isn't going to last.
And when it comes to the international implications for the whole region, I mean, you said that the Syrian part of the PKK is not part of this agreement. But is there a sense that I think what's been described as a terror-free Turkey is something that will have positive repercussions across the region?
Yeah, of course, on many levels. I mean, first of all, the region where the PKK operates in the southeast of the country is beautiful. It's got so many, cultural, historic, natural gems. And there is a kind of, tourism industry creeping in there since, the end of the latest round of fighting. So there'll be those benefits, but also it really boosts Ankara's hand, particularly in the region. This opens the way for, new kind of strengthening ties with Baghdad. There's been a sort of long-running disagreement between Turkey and the Iraqi government about Turkey's operations against the PKK in northern Iraq. That obviously helps as well. And just, it's always been a kind of, hovering over Turkey's head, constant criticisms from the international community about human rights abuses in this ongoing 40-year war in the southeast. So to be able to sort of move on from that era would be hugely beneficial to Turkey.
Hannah Lucinda Smith, Monocle's Istanbul correspondent. Thank you as ever for joining us on The Briefing. .20 here in London. Time for a catch-up with the Lusophone world. Our senior correspondent, Fernando Augusto Pacheco, joins me now to bring us up to date. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Emma. Bom dia.
Bom dia. Before we move on to what is happening at the moment in the future, let's just briefly touch on what was a lovely little afternoon. Well, not a little afternoon, a significantly delightful afternoon at Midori House on Saturday.
It was amazing. We're hosting a spring market in partnership with Visit Portugal. So there were a lot of stands selling Portuguese food, Portuguese products. And Emma, I arrived a little bit later in the afternoon, but when I arrived, actually many of the stands, they were sold out. We have Klaus Porto, they sell amazing soaps there as well. And I do love Portuguese food, a good bifana, which is their kind of steak sandwiches. And of course, after that, there was a nice talk between our editor, Andrew Tuck, and Carlota Rebelo from the island of Madeira, with very good guests as well. So it was a really, really pleasant market.
And a moment when the Portuguese-speaking world does rather well for itself and sort of does what it does so well. Let's look now at what the headlines are in Brazil. Folha de Sao Paulo, where are we going? What are we doing with that?
This is such an interesting story. It's a topic that I've been covering here on The Briefing for a while. Basically, it's talking about that the number of political parties in Brazil are falling by 30%, according to this article published today. And I think it's a good thing, Emma. Basically, in 2015, our Congress, we had 35 political parties. And that's one of the reasons why our system is so dysfunctional, because quite a lot of those parties, unlike here in the UK, for example, there's a lack of ideology. They're just there for power, so they can go with either Lula or Bolsonaro. You wouldn't even identify, are they right, are they left? So there's been a lot of kind of laws. I mean, you need to have a certain number of, Brazilians signing saying that I would like this political party to exist. Because before it was very easy to have a political party. There were almost no regulation whatsoever. So thanks to those new regulations, apparently the number is about to fall to 16. And lots of those political parties, they're getting together and they're grouping together. And I think it makes total sense.
Will that give a better sense of clarity as to who stands for what and who sides where?
Absolutely, because, of course, the Workers' Party, let's say for Lula, was one of the few political parties that Brazilians knew what they stand for. Of course, clearly they are more towards the left, or we have PL, the Bolsonaro, clearly more centered towards the right. But all those in-between parties, which you definitely need if you want to become a president of Brazil, now things will be more clarified in that sense. And if I may risk say something not controversial, but I think the reason why perhaps there's so much corruption in Brazil is because those political parties, as I said, there's no ideology. They can go with Lula, they can go with Bolsonaro, whoever gives them more benefits in a way.
Let's move on to part of the Portuguese diaspora, to Angola, southern western African country. This is a big story in terms of a place of investment for Brazil.
Big story from Valor, which is a newspaper that I really admire, is our version of the Financial Times, let's say, talking about Brazilians investing in the agribusiness sector in Angola. Lots of farmers actually moving to Angola because, first of all, it's cheaper. The land is fertile. There's a common language in there. And Angola, I know it's early days, but they want to become more of an agricultural powerhouse. They're not quite there yet. There are challenges. There's lack of infrastructure. There's not enough qualified workers to work in those farmers and in this industry. But it's so interesting, this relationship between Brazil and Angola. I had no idea. And in this article is a really big piece, actually. There was interviewing a farmer who's been living there for 40 years. And he was saying, you know what, I would rather actually have a farm here in Angola. Things grow much faster and, there's some, and the costs, because Brazil's actually quite expensive, that sector. Really interesting piece from Valor.
Thank you for that. Finally, let's touch on what makes a villain. I know you love stories like this, so you're going to go to town a bit.
This is my favorite story, and this is super interesting. So basically, for some context, in 1988, we had a soap opera, Vale Tudo, is known as the best soap opera of all time in Brazil by critics. And they had a character called Odete Reutemann. She was the CEO of an airline company, but she was evil. She's known as the villain, you know.
Oh, we love so it's an evil Brazilian airline boss.
Yes,
Great.
with a penchant for young lovers as well. And she
Obviously.
loved drinking champagne. She didn't like her kids very much. At that time, she was evil. But the thing is, Emma, look how the world changes. Now they're playing the remake of Vale Tudo, and that same character is loved.
Why?
Well, I'll tell you after we listen to a clip. I know a lot of our listeners don't listen to Portuguese, but just feel the chicness in her voice.
You'll have to do
please.
some translation for us.
Absolutely.
Odete Reutemann chegou.
Tá linda, mãe.
Não sei por quanto tempo, porque com essa umidade de aquário do Rio de Janeiro, eu não me importo com o que os meus filhos falam sobre mim. Aliás, eu também falo coisas terríveis sobre eles. Uma filha que só vive pelas tabelas. Um filho obcecado por essa espelunca de país.
Isn't it wonderful when you don't actually, forgive me, my Portuguese is zero, but you get an incredibly strong feeling just from the tone of voice.
Absolutely.
I'm getting an awful lot of Joan Collins dynasty area.
Absolutely.
Right.
I mean, she was literally in a bath with a glass of champagne, saying horrible things about her kids. And Brazil, she hates Brazil. She says, oh my God, it's so hot. In this country, nothing works, you know? So there's a lot of self-criticism to Brazil. And one of her kids, I mean, unfortunately, she's an alcoholic. And the other one is a playboy who loves running at 5 a.m., but he doesn't do much at the company. So she's really kind of cruel a little bit to them. But people are identifying with her.
Why is she becoming is she becoming a virtuous character now that we love, or is she still one of those wonderful, delicious characters who we adore to hate?
She's still very much, a delicious character. She is a little bit evil, and I think she'll do a lot of bad things. But the thing is, her kids are a little bit useless in that sense. I mean, her playboy kid, he loves running in Rio, but it's not helping her in the company. So people are realizing that. And her sex life as well. That's something that changed. In the 80s, there were a lot of people were very judgmental about women's sexual life. And now she has all those lovers, and people say, you know what? You go, Odete, and she's very glamorous as well. Yeah. So it's very interesting character and how perceptions have changed in Brazil.
Ambitions for us all. Monocle senior correspondent Fernanda Augusta Pacheco, thank you so much for joining me on The Briefing. Finally, today, the Cannes Film Festival kicks off tomorrow. For a preview of what's on the cards on the Croisette and inside the Palais des Congrès, Karen Krasanovic, film critic, regular voice here on Monocle Radio, comes with her to-do list for the festival. How are you?
Well, it's going to be Cannes. What can I say?
Exactly. So where do we begin with Cannes?
Where do we begin? Okay, you have to remember that Cannes is pointing to Sean Baker's win at the Oscars. Look, we had a Nora first, and everybody's going to go, ooh, maybe it's a springboard. Let's not forget there are some other festivals as well, but Cannes will not have it. In Cannes' mind, Cannes is the only festival, and that's where you have to take it. So we've got Tom Cruise coming back with the Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning. Will it be the final reckoning? We wonder. Also, we've got Robert De Niro, because everybody really wants to see him get an honorary Palme d'Or just when we think he really should stop making movies. But, that's my opinion. It's just shy of the 50th anniversary of Taxi Driver. And then we've got Spike Lee, who was a jury president in 2021. And he remember when he accidentally announced the winner's name? No, maybe you don't. Okay. But he's here doing Highest to Lowest, which is going to be, turn my phone off there. That's a good idea. It's coming right after Ethan Cohen's comedy, which is his second in a trilogy of lesbian B movies.
Excellent. We love them.
Isn't that was a fast in there?
Yes, off we go. The list you've just given me is not of up-and-coming names, is it? I mean, when you talk about Tom Cruise, I do just think that how are the joints getting on? How's the back first thing in the morning?
He's great. He's in great shape. he's got a grip. When you shake his hand, wow. It's just, he's our last big movie star. He really is.
I couldn't imagine him having a bit of a floppy handshake, though, could you? That would be such a disappointment.
Gosh, no, he doesn't.
Does it sort of go full bicep when he goes in?
It's that hand that hangs off mountains and helicopters. It really does. Grip strength, a go-go. You got any jars at your house that need opening? Call Tom.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, he can
Seriously.
maybe help with the
He's got an amazing energy, but enough of Tom. Up and coming, well, Canada is always good for people that are independent movie makers. For example, up and coming, Kelly Reichardt's been making a lot of movies. She did a fantastic film called Showing Up, which is about a sculptor. It was really deftly done, and now she's got The Mastermind, which is getting some buzz, featuring Josh O'Connor. It's set in the 70s, of course, so that automatically means it's going to be more expensive. He and 2 cohorts wander into a museum in broad daylight and steal 4 paintings.
Wonderful.
There you go.
Let's look ahead as well to, we're talking about the new generation there and Tom Cruise coming around to Open My Jars, which is just a wonderful idea.
I'm so sorry to throw you off track.
It's not because of Tom Cruise, it's because he could open my jars. But you have this idea that, Tom Cruise has stepped behind the camera as well, but this idea now that if you are a famous film star, it is almost your God-given right to go and step behind the camera. This is happening increasingly, isn't it? And to what degree of success, Karen?
Well, this has been happening all along. Jerry Lewis. You could name any actor, and most of them will want to produce, write, direct, or do all of those things, simply because it gives you. They're storytellers. Everybody that works in the film industry is a storyteller, and actors especially. So we've got how successful is it? Well, it can vary. If you look, if we're counting, let's say, White Lotus, it can be very successful. But we've got Kristen Stewart coming out with her debut, where she's directing Imogen Poots in The Chronology of Water, which is an adaptation of Lydia Yukinovich's memoir. See, I just said that name. The one I'm really looking forward to is Scarlett Johansson. We all know her. She's doing Eleanor the Great, which stars June Squibb, who I believe is in her 90s. And she actually headlined a movie last year that needed more attention. But Harris Dickinson, last seen in Baby Girl, has written and directed Urchin. And a friend of mine has seen it already and said it's really good. It's set on the streets of London. So get yourself prepared.
Karen Krasanovich, thank you as ever for joining us in the studio. And that's all the time we have for today's edition of The Briefing. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producer Hassan Anderson, our researcher was Francesca Jilks, and our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. The Briefing's back at the same time tomorrow, but for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thanks for listening.